professor at the University College London, professor of philosophy, and he is director of the UCL Center for Philosophy, Justice and Health. He is a member of the Nuffield Council of Bioethics and has published several books, including Ethics in Public Policy, a Philosophical Inquiry, which is the subject of a specialized symposium within the conference that is currently being held at the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory, as well as the Human Right to Health and a number of other books. This evening, Professor Wolff will speak on the topic of, is it immoral to put a price on life? A topic that is directly relevant to the concerns of many of us. So without further ado, Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you to all of you for turning out on a Friday night. It is Friday. Friday night. I'm slightly dazed and confused at the moment. I wouldn't have come on a Friday night to hear me talk, so thank you. Thank you all. So the topic I'm going to talk about is one that I got involved with in a way accidentally, but I'll begin by telling you a little bit about one episode of my life before I started at university. So in the late 1970s, when I left school, I took a job as a clerk in an insurance office. And I was a daily commuter in London from a station called Bromley South to a now defunct station called Holborn Viaduct. And like all the other commuters, who were getting these what were then filthy, smelly trains, and every day we'd go into work on the train as a commuter. And when the train was about to come into the station, we would push down the window on the door, put our hands outside the door, open the door slightly while the train was still moving, lean out. It's much better if I'm standing up, but I'm too tired to stand up now. So lean like this on the door, and then when the train stopped, got to walking pace, roughly, we'd pull our hands up, the door would fly open, and we would jump out while the train was still moving, and get to our desks about 3 seconds earlier than we would have done had we just stayed on the train as normal. And this is what all male commuters did this. Female commuters didn't, always. And this is just what we did. Now those trains, those doors were called slam door trains. So now we're used to doors on trains mostly that slide, or have a lock that stops you opening them. But these trains, in the 1970s, they had doors that you could open when the train was moving. However fast the train was moving, you could open the door. And the only safety device was that you couldn't open it from the inside. So you had to pull down the window, which was quite hard, put your hand out, and open it from the outside. So you couldn't open it by accident, and a child couldn't open it. But if an adult wanted to open the door, there was nothing stopping them, however fast the train was going. Okay, so those were called slam door trains. And I didn't think anything of it. This is just what we did. And then a bit later when I traveled on the trains, the doors changed. That you couldn't open them fully. There'd be a type of lock, so they'd open a little bit, but then would stop until it was released. Or you had sliding doors. Now, in the early 2000s, around 2001, 2002, I was asked to do some work for the railway industry. And one of the things that they sent me was a paper about railway safety, and that is really the topic of this talk. And they described the safety record of these slam door trains, as they were called. And when we were using them on British Rail, as it was, there were something between about 12 and 20 deaths a year because of these doors. So half the deaths, roughly, were people who opened the door and fell out while the train was moving too quickly. There were one or two where people fell out, maybe it was suicide, no one can really tell, at very high speed. They were very rare. But the more common deaths were the train was coming into the station, people were doing exactly what I had described, but let go the door too early and fell out. That was half the deaths. The other half of the deaths were people standing on the platform, waiting for the next train. And as the door, which was very heavy, opened, quite a number of people got hit by the door and died or were seriously injured by this very heavy bit of metal just flying open and hitting them. Okay. So suppose there are about 20 deaths a year just because of those slam doors. Okay. So this paper raised the question of whether those trains, those carriages with slam doors, should have been phased out or not. Should they have been replaced? Because by the time this became a matter of public concern, they were very widespread. They were in very widespread use on the railways. I don't know why it suddenly became of interest, but it did sometime in the 1980s, 1990s. And the engineers on the railways were clear that this was a bad design. It was not, we shouldn't have trains like that. If it was possible to modify them so the doors didn't open, we should do that. And for some of the carriages, that's what happened, as I said, that it was possible to change the design. But for most of them, it wasn't possible. It just was not technically possible to make these carriages safe. So that we had a choice of either carrying on using them or getting rid of them. Now, bearing in mind that these carriages had an extra, say, 20 or 30 years of life before they were expected to have worn out, it was going to be incredibly expensive to replace these carriages. And so the question was, should it be done or not? Should we replace these carriages to save 20 lives a year, or should we leave them? So that was a question that they had in the late 80s, early 90s. They'd done the rough analysis, and they could then do some cost-benefit analysis. Because they knew how much it would cost to replace the carriages earlier. If they'd done nothing, they would have had to replace the carriages in 20 years, 30 years. If they brought the replacement forward, that would cost them a lot of money, hundreds of millions of pounds at that time, in order to replace the carriages. And they worked out that, using various discount factors and so on, that it would cost roughly £5 million per life saved if they were going to replace the carriages. Because one of the things that is, for me, was interesting, very helpful thinking about railway safety, is the numbers, the data sets are very big for railway travellers. So you pretty much know what's going to happen next year. If you don't do anything, what's going to happen next year is roughly the same as what happened this year. And so the numbers of deaths, numbers of injuries are pretty constant. There's small variation. So we knew that, or at the time they knew that by replacing these carriages, they'd save 15 lives a year, and it would cost a certain amount of money, and that came out at £5 million per life saved. So they had the question, should they do it or not? We'll come back to that. So that is the type of question we're talking about today. Is that a callous way of thinking about how to make the safety decision? Should they have gone ahead and changed the carriages as soon as they knew they would have saved lives? Should they have not done a financial calculation? What should they have done? Okay, so as I said, that's the question. How did I get into this at all? Why did I get into thinking about this? Well, around about 2001, 2002, the trains in Britain had a terrible reputation for safety. There had been a number of crashes, and the newspapers were full of stories about how dangerous the trains were. And this was also linked to a type of narrative about privatisation, because a little bit before that, a year or two before that, the trains had been privatised. This had been very unpopular, and so the trade unions were saying the rail industry has been privatised, we have new bosses who are negligent about safety, and look what happens, all these trains start crashing. So that was part of the political context. and the newspapers loved it. So we all thought, everyone including me, thought that railway safety in the UK was scandalous, and this was a result of privatisation. Now, one of my former students, actually he hadn't been a very good student, but never mind, one of these former students phoned me up and said he's now working for an organisation called Railway Safety and Standards Board. And they're very interested in the ethics of railway safety. And his boss, who was a statistician, had thought that this question, should we phase out slam door trains, was a moral question. So that shows some enlightenment. This is a moral question. You don't just talk to the economists. And as he, as my former student had been a philosophy student, he'd asked him about philosophy, and my student had told him about consequentialism and deontology. And so he'd gone off to read some books. The statistician had gone to the library or bought books, Introduction to Moral Philosophy, and he read the philosophy textbooks, hoping to get some enlightenment on what they should do in this question, in this issue. Should they? And they already made a decision about that. There was another decision I'll come on to. And my student reported that his boss had got stuck. I thought it's time to talk to a philosopher, that he doesn't understand enough about this just from reading books. So they needed someone else. And I realized what they were asking, and I think I may be the only one in history. I was a moral consultant to the railway industry. And it was the most extraordinary thing, because I was paid to do this, and some of it was being paid paid very well, actually, to read philosophy, which was an amazing thing, by the hour. So I had my clock. But also to write about it and talk about the issue. And the reason why this was particularly important at the time was that they had made a number of big safety improvements. So they had phased out slam door trains. So they decided that the 5 million or whatever it was per life saved was something they ought to pay at that time. And they just introduced a new signalling system that made it harder for trains to go through a red light. Not impossible, but harder. And that cost something like 12 million per life saved. They were still getting press stories about how they were negligent about passenger safety. And the issue at the time was that a new safety system called ATP, Advanced Train Protection, was available, and it was being used on some lines in Germany and France, no doubt Switzerland, but this was modern European safety standards. And if a train had ATP, Advanced Train Protection, then if the system was working, and they don't always work, but if the system was working, then the train could not go through a red light. Whereas in the UK, it was possible for a driver to drive a train through a red light. It was difficult, because the train was automatically slowed down, all sorts of warnings went off, and you had to press various buttons and so on. But it was possible for a train driver to take a train through a red light. And there were a couple of accidents that had been caused by trains going through a red light. And in some cases, they'd run into the train in front, in another case, they'd hit a train coming in another direction. So it had a couple of crashes. Actually, most of those were no longer possible because of the new signalling system that was involved. But they were being criticised by some newspapers. The industry was being criticised for not introducing this new system, ATP. So what would ATP have done? Well, first of all, it would have saved about 2 lives a year. It couldn't have saved more than that because hardly anyone was dying in train crashes anymore. So even though we'd had these train crashes, only small numbers of people were dying in them, 5 people, 10 people per crash, not 100 people. So only small numbers of people were dying in the crashes. And they weren't all caused by trains going through red lights. There were other causes as well. So statistically, this new system would have only saved about 2 lives a year. And it was going to cost £6 billion to introduce. And in those days, £6 billion sounded like a lot of money. We amazingly hear of these stories now about banks losing that as a matter of ordinary commerce in a year or something. But at that time, £6 billion to save 2 lives a year. And so that would have put the price of saving a life, various discount factors, other things taken into account, up to about £125 million to save a life. Now, the people in the industry thought that that was excessive, that it should not, no one should have to spend £125 million to save a life. Also, they pointed out this actually came from tax, even though the railways have been privatised, the money for safety came from the taxpayer. So it would have been the ordinary taxpayer paying this money. And the statistician wrote a paper, which he sent me, explaining the history of this, and saying that if you have a certain amount of money, and you want to spend it to do good, or to save lives, just about the worst thing you could do would be to spend it on railway safety. If you've got this £6 billion, you'll save 40 lives or whatever it is over a period of 20 years. But for £6 billion, you could have saved 10 times, 100 times as many lives as that on road safety, 1,000 times as many in the National Health Service, and probably 1,000,000 times as many on international development. And so they said, from the point of view of efficiency, the worst thing we could do was to bring in these safety improvements in the railways, in terms of money spent on saving lives. But at the same time, they were being criticised by the respectable press. The Observer newspaper, even the Guardian newspaper, was arguing that they were negligent with passenger safety because of this. And the statistician said to me that he'd read the philosophy books and he'd come up with his own analysis, which was that as far as the industry was concerned, they were taking a consequentialist view here. And that from the industry's point of view, if you're spending money and you want to get the best consequences, don't spend taxpayers' money on this ridiculous safety system. But he said there's another view, which is the deontological view, or the absolutist view, which says, if we know how to save a life, we have an absolute duty to do it. And money should not be a consideration. So he'd got that far. There are two views in philosophical literature, the absolutist view and the consequentialist view. And he wanted to know what we do next. Now we know that there are these two views, which I thought was a very interesting question. What do we do next? And then in the course of this, I learnt that the approach that they were taking in the railway industry was actually the standard approach to safety that is taken pretty much, in many countries, not every country, but certainly the English-speaking countries and many other European countries. And there is a paper produced by the Health and Safety Executive in the UK called Reducing Risk, Protecting People, which explains how you should approach safety. If you're suppose you're a factory owner. This is about health and safety at work. Suppose you own a factory and you have a production line. Most machinery is dangerous to some degree. So any machinery you have in your factory, someone might get their hand caught or their hair caught, or they might get electrocuted. There are going to be risks. But it's always possible to reduce the risk. It's always possible to do something that will reduce the risk. At the limit, you just close down your factory, and then your factory is not a risk to anyone anymore. So you can always eliminate risk by eliminating activity. But government doesn't want to close down all factories. They want to say we've got to have the right balance between economic activity and safety. So how do we strike that balance? And what they say is we put well, this is a crude interpretation. You'll see there are some subtleties here, but putting it crudely, what they say is we have to put a price on life. And if you can introduce a safety measure, and the figure in the UK now is £1.3 million. If you can introduce a safety measure that for less than £1.3 million can be expected to save a life, you have a duty to do it. If it costs more than 1.3 million, then you don't have a duty. In the United States, the figure is $6.2 million. So the conversion rate, that makes Americans about 3 times as valuable as the Brits. I was trying to find a figure for Serbia. I haven't found one. The closest I found, geographically and culturally, the closest I found is the Czech Republic. which you may not find a useful comparison. But the last figures I saw there, and this is out of date, I'm sure it's gone up, was about £300,000. So culturally, there are big differences. What it does, it relates to average income, of course, but not in a linear way, which is interesting. That is, the higher the income, the more proportion of your income you're prepared to pay on safety. That you run out of other things to spend your money on, so you spend more on safety. But as the GDP goes down in the country, they become more and more, or less risk averse, because you have other things that you need to spend the money on. So safety, interestingly, is a type of luxury good in this respect. But anyway, that was the what I found in reading this paper, Reducing Risk, Protecting People, which more or less says we put a price on life. And not only do we do it, you're required to do it. And the government does it, and all governments do it. And I was astounded to see this, because I had no idea this is how decisions were taken. I thought as a philosopher that you should never put a value on life. But there we are, we put 1.3 million on it in the UK. And I thought, well, how do we get there? And how do we get the figure at all? How do we get that figure? Who was asked? Who are the people who tell us what the value of life should be? I was amazed because I hadn't seen any philosophical discussions of this at all in the safety area. There are some in health, because there are similar issues about valuing states of health, debates about quality adjusted life years, and how much we should spend on pharmaceuticals. Those have become more prominent in the last 10 years. 20, 30 years ago, it was a very specialized area. But there's, as far as I know, no equivalent discussion about health and safety in the philosophical literature. There is in the economics literature, there is in engineering, but not in philosophy. And so these decisions were made by economists, essentially. So I thought it's time for some philosophers to tell the economists what they ought to be doing here. It's our turn to get involved. And walking around railway safety, the Railway Safety and Standards Board, they were showing me around the offices, and there was a big room, and they said, this is where the economists are. I said, that's very interesting. Where are your philosophers? Where are your sociologists? Where are your anthropologists? But no, the only people they were interested in, apart from engineers, were economists. Okay. So, the two questions, I think, that we need to think about here is, first of all, is it immoral to put a price on life? And if we do put a price on life, how do we get it? How do we get that figure? Where does 1.3 million come from? Why 1.3? Why not 1? Why not 5? Why not 6.2 million? Why not something else? So, just a little bit of history. In the UK, we used to have a much lower figure than 1.3 million. We used to have a figure of around £50,000, the price of life. This was in the 70s and 80s. And this was derived by the so-called human capital approach. And this was the idea of an average person, what do they contribute in their lifetime to the economy? So if you lose a person, what have you lost? Well, you've lost about £50,000. Why is that? Well, because if you think, well, what do they produce, what do they consume? The average person in their lifetime, they'll produce £50,000 more goods than they'll consume. So a person is worth £50,000. That was thought rather low as a figure for the price of life, and so there are various dodges done. But it's pointed out actually that if that's the way you're going to do it, the human capital approach, then your value changes a lot over your life. And once you retire, you stop producing, you only consume. So the value of your life becomes negative. If we take this approach, we should start subsidizing activities that are dangerous to old people in the hope that we'll turn a profit this way. So this was not considered an acceptable view. So how do we go about putting a price on life? And isn't it immoral to do so? Well, the decisive turn was taken actually by two people, one in France and one in the United States. I think the French economist got there first, Drees, who's the father of the economist who has worked with Sen. But he wrote in French, so everyone in the United States just ignored this, and I think everyone in the UK as well. But the game theorist Thomas Schelling made the same point. And what he said is that we think of the price of life as this very morally troubling thing. But, he said, actually, when we're talking about making something like a workplace safer, or making transport safer, we're not actually talking about the price of any individual's life. Because if we introduce a safety measure, we have no idea who we've saved. Well, we can't point to an individual and say, you are alive and you wouldn't have been had we not done this. The hypothetical, the hypothetical is impossible. And so what Schelling suggested is that what we do when we make the world a little bit safer is we make every individual's life slightly safer. And that adds up to the saving of lives when you've got enough people. But if you make my life a little bit safer, your life a little bit safer, there'll be fewer deaths overall than there would have been. And then he points out, and this is the key conceptual move, that safety in that sense is just an ordinary economic good. Because we spend money on things that make our lives a little bit safer. So if you cycle, you might have bought a helmet. You're reducing the risk of death a little bit. You might buy a smoke alarm for your house. In the old days in the UK, you could buy two types of tyres, cross-ply or radial. Cross-ply were cheaper, but we all knew they were a bit more dangerous. We didn't know how much. So if you bought radial tyres instead of cross-ply tyres, you were purchasing safety. And so Schelling says, actually, what we do all the time is purchase safety. It's perfectly ordinary. So we ought to be able to put a value on life based on what individuals would do on these small safety decisions. So all we need to do is find out how individuals price these small safety decisions. And then by a bit of economic algorithm tinkering, we can come up with a price of life. So this is very interesting now. We have to start trying to work out what would people pay to make their environment a little bit safer. And yeah, this is an interesting topic. I don't want to dwell on it for too long, but in the literature there are two approaches. There's the American approach, which is revealed preference approach, where economists look at how much more you have to pay people to do dangerous jobs. And they know the jobs are slightly more dangerous, you have to pay them a bit more. You can use that market information to come up with a price of life. Now, that's the theory in any case. Unfortunately, you get very variable outcomes from doing that, but that's one way of doing it. In the UK, we don't do that. Partly we've been influenced by the type of arguments that Donald Davidson put forward, which says that you can't go from people's behaviour to their beliefs or their desires, because there are so many different ways in which one bit of behaviour is consistent with any type of mental state. Now, you might take a job not because it pays you more, but because it's closer to home, or you've got friends who work there. So you can't say anything about people's attitudes to risk. Okay, the Americans think this is nonsense, and the averages work out. But what we do in the UK is so-called contingent valuation, where we ask people how much they would pay to reduce risk in their life. And then we use that data to come up with these figures. Okay. So is this a sensible approach? Well, let me ask you this question. Suppose I'm the experimenter, you've walked into my lab now, because of course it has to be a lab. It's actually an office with a bit of paper on the desk, but we call it a lab. So you walk into my lab, and I start asking my questions. I don't do this work, I haven't done this work. And if we were doing, so the early studies, the very early studies said, suppose you have a 1 in 1,000 chance of dying next year. Okay, so take that. What would you pay to reduce that to a 1 in 2,000 chance? Okay, so think about that question. You've got a 1 in 1,000 chance of dying next year. What would you pay to reduce that to a 1 in 2,000 chance? chance. Anyone have any thoughts in their head? Does a number flash up for anyone? No? Nothing at all?
Some people actually hoped that there would be the end to the world.
Right, beforehand.
They
Right,
felt
so
this was a
yeah,
relief.
yeah. Well, actually, you might pay nothing. Right, you want the opposite. Yeah. So there are some people who might want to pay to increase risk in their life. Okay. So from your silence, I think you probably find this either a very difficult question to answer or a stupid question. One of the findings is whatever you ask people, if they're in America, they answer $50, roughly speaking, whatever the question about risk reduction, they say $50. And in England, it's about £20. And so, in fact, what this means, you'll see, is you can get whatever answer you want to the question of how much a life is worth, just by phrasing the correct risk question to begin with. So, because we're just hopeless at thinking. Evolution has not equipped us with intuitions about how much would we pay to reduce our risk from 1 in 1,000 to 1 in 2,000. So we just don't know how to think about these questions. So the experimenters have to do some quite detailed tricks to get people to say anything at all. But anyway, we get a figure out of it. But the interesting thing about it is that it's called the value of preventing a fatality or the value of statistical life. But it's presented and derived by this idea of aggregating lots of small risk reductions. So if we're introducing a safety measure, we're introducing these small risk reductions, and it aggregates to this idea that we need to pay 1.3 million or whatever it is to save a life. Yeah. Come on in. So if we go back to the figures that I was talking about before, you have a statutory obligation in the UK to introduce a safety measure that was going to cost 1.3 million or less to save a life. Slam door trains were phased out. That was 5 million a year. 5 million per life. So much in excess of the minimum. The new signalling system that was brought in was £12 million per life saved. And the one that they were supposedly negligent for not bringing in was going to cost 125 million. And the statutory obligation was 1.3 million per life saved. So this is why the industry didn't want to bring it in. They thought it was just absurd to do this. But then there was a question about why it was that they thought they should be doing this. And they had this view that the public were clamoring for this safety system. The public were irrational, but what could they do? They had this terrible reputation. As I went round the industry talking to people, many people were skeptical about whether the public had any view at all about safety systems. And the idea that somehow the public wanted this was very controversial. What was clear was that the newspapers were making a big story about it. And there were and the unions were making a big story about it, but that was mixed up with the debate about privatization. And some victims groups, people whose kids had died of railways, were making a big fuss about it. But there was a real question about whether these people spoke for the public or not. And so we did a study with a psychologist at ECL. We did a big qualitative interview study, trying to find out whether the public were clamoring for this safety system. And we did it through semi-structured interviews. So we didn't prompt them, we just got them talking. And we interviewed 80 people, so it was quite a big study, cost quite a lot of money. And not one of them mentioned, out of the 80 people, not one of them mentioned the signalling system that supposedly the public were clamoring for. And hardly anyone mentioned technology, absence of technology as a problem. And they were full of stories about how terrible the trains were, and sometimes how unsafe they felt, but they never felt that they were in danger of the trains crashing, interestingly enough. When they talked about their security, it was about personal security, being attacked or robbed, particularly late at night. So no one was thinking about trains crashing. So they had no interest in this security system, even though supposedly the public were clamoring for it. And what we realised is that in the UK, trains are just fantastic newspaper copy. There was, at the same time I was doing my work, the industry commissioned a media company, in fact a university, to look at stories on the media. And there was a year in which there were no train crashes in the UK as we were doing this. In fact, there have been barely any crashes since we've done this work. But there were no train crashes, but nevertheless there were 2,000 stories about train crashes in the press. As part of our study, we did a qualitative interview, and then we asked a number of quantitative questions afterwards. We finished the qualitative, and so for the 80 people, we asked them questions like, how many people die in train crashes on average in the UK each year? So how many passengers die? And the lowest answer we got was 10. The highest answer we got was 1,000. The truth was 5. So no one got near. And we thought, well, there are these people who thought 1,000 people are dying. What do they think is going on? Because in the newspaper you hear about these crashes where 5 people or 10 people die every 2 years or so. And one person said, well, no, those are the only ones we hear about. I'm sure that there must be others that we just don't hear about because there are these crashes. And in fact, there have only been half a dozen high-profile crashes, and everyone in the UK knows their names. They can tell you where they were. There was one at Potter's Bar, Hatfield, Grape Heck, and so on. One at Clapham. So just a very small number of these. And these are part of our folk myth now, that everyone knows about these crashes. So, were the industry negligent in not spending this amount of money? Were they negligent in putting a price on life? Well, I'm sympathetic to the idea that they're not really putting a price on life. They're putting a price on small risk reduction, which is different to the health service, actually, where you do put a price on life. But in this area, you're putting a price on small risk reduction. Should they have spent more than they did? Should they have spent 5 million, 12 million, 125 million? How do you know how much they should spend? Now, the minimum they were meant to spend, they would have been breaking the law if they weren't spending 1.3 million to save lives. But they were clearly prepared to spend more than that, indeed much more than that. But why? What was going on here? Well, as we were doing our interviews, it became very clear that ordinary people regarded safety in a different way to the economists. Big surprise, I suppose. So as far as the economists are concerned, if you're thinking about risk and safety, there are only 2 things you really need to know. One is, what is the hazard, in this case death, and the other is what is the probability. And risks are ranked in terms of probability times hazard. So the higher the probability of death, the worse the risk. And so a risk where there's a 10% chance of death is much worse than a risk where there's a 5% chance of death, say from an economist's point of view. But what we found is that the public view different train crashes in a different way. So here are 2 of the train crashes that the public knew about. They were very recent. Bizarrely, they both involved the same engine, just by coincidence, because they had nothing to do with the engine. But of all the engines that were, I'm presuming on sentimental grounds or superstitious grounds, they probably scrapped the engine after this, after being involved in the 2 crashes. But one of them was at a station, or near a station called Hatfield, near Cambridge, on the way to Cambridge. And a train had gone over a bit of faulty track. It was at high speed, it was going about 120 miles an hour, and it went over the track, and the track shattered as it was going round the corner. So it was going round the corner on this track, and as the track shattered, the train fell off the track. About 5 people died. The industry said this was a type of failure of the track they'd never heard of before. It was called gauge corner cracking, they said. And they couldn't tell us what the probability of it was because it was a one-off event. But they didn't know it might happen again. There was something wrong with the track. They could see that afterwards. And so they said, we've got to check every bit of track in the UK. So if anyone travelled on a train in the UK between about 6 months, around about 2002, you had no idea when your train was going to arrive. because there was a 20 mile an hour speed limit on the whole of the track, and they couldn't run a timetable. And so you get in the train, and it could be normally a 1 hour journey, it would take 10 hours. So people stopped taking the trains, started driving, and some people have pointed out probably 50 people died as a result, because going by car is much more dangerous than going by train. So all these people stopped going by train, started going by car or by motorbike, and were dying all over the place, I suppose. So only 5 people died in the Hatfield crash, but 50 people died while we were investigating its causes and making sure it didn't generate other things. So the Hatfield crash, though, was one where actually the industry knew that that track was faulty. And they'd tried to replace it, they'd botched the repair, they hadn't been able to do the repair because they brought the wrong equipment, and they just said, well, we'll do it in the winter, we don't want to disrupt the summer timetable, so we'll do it in 6 months' time. No one thought to put a speed limit on the bit of track they knew was faulty. So the industry was seriously at fault there. A few months later, there was another accident in Great Heck in the north of England. In this case, what happened was someone was driving his Land Rover, and he fell asleep at the wheel. And he was pulling a trailer behind him. He fell asleep, and he ran up against the side of the road, and his trailer became detached from the back of his car and went down onto the track. And so the trailer actually went onto the track. And so he woke up, he saw what had happened, he went off to an emergency phone box, he phoned the railway service and said, yeah, my trailer's on the track. And just as he was on the phone, a passenger train hit the trailer, and it did something called jumping tracks, which is almost unheard of. That is, normally if the train comes off the track, it stops, it derails. But this train, it's like a kid's toy train, it came off the tracks but carried on going. So it ran along the gravel, but it was now a metre further over to the middle of the rail. And as it was going along, there was a goods train coming in the other direction. And so they had a full speed head-on collision between the two trains. And in both cases, around about 5 people died. Now, when we were interviewing members of the public, they were full of anger and blame about the Hatfield crash, where the industry knew that there was something wrong with the track, but didn't deal with it. And they were full of sympathy for the industry, for the other crash. Because this was a driver who'd fallen asleep, and the newspapers, of course, wanted to find out about him, and they found he'd fallen asleep because he spent the whole of the night on the telephone to a girl he'd met on the internet. What a fantastic news story this was. This is the modern world. You meet someone on the internet, you spend all evening on the phone to her, and then you kill 5 people the next day because you fall asleep. And he was accused of manslaughter, he admitted guilt, and was sent to jail for 2 years. But as far as the public was concerned, this was a tragic accident, whereas the other one was the industry's negligence. Now think about the economist's view. Both of these were one-off events. The gauge corner cracking, we'd never heard of this before. We'd also never heard of a train jumping the track in the way it did and having a head-on collision. So in terms of frequency, these are 1 in 300 years. In fact, when something came up, one of the analysts said that one in the north of England with the trailer coming onto the track and all those circumstances, that's the sort of thing we could expect to happen once every 2,500 years, they said. Round about the time that this was built was the last accident like that. So yeah, completely meaningless statistic. But the point is these were both equally rare. But in one case, the public blamed the driver of the Land Rover. In the other case, they blamed the industry. And what occurred to us is that when there's something like one of these accidents, there's what you could call a type of blame audit trail. We want to know whose fault it is. And we want to know who's to blame, whether it's Hurricane Katrina, whether it's these train crashes, any bad thing happens, we want to find where the blame audit trail rests. And what we realized in this study is where if the blame audit trail points back at the industry, that is a really serious problem for the industry. But if the blame audit trail points to someone outside, that seems very different. So, okay, we notice this. The question is it purely a psychological fact? Right? Or is there anything deeper to this? So is a blame audit trail telling us anything about moral responsibility? Or is it just a psychosociological fact about what we're like as human beings? We've got to find a culprit. And yeah, for quite a long time I wasn't sure what to think about this, but I think probably the blame audit trail is a type of primitive epistemology of ethics here. That we're not just blaming because that's what we're like, but we're blaming because something went wrong here. And that using this type of cost-benefit analysis for external shocks to the industry seems about right to me. That is, if you're thinking about what types of fences should we put up to stop trailers coming onto the railway track, now, an economic calculation seems like the only way of doing this. But if you're thinking about things that are much more directly under your control, should we cut maintenance? Should we introduce things that will save us some money, knowing that this is going to increase risk? Then the economic calculation seems quite wrong. And there, of course, there's a different issue, because if you're making things more dangerous, then it looks like it's wrong to put a price on life. But if you're making things safer, there has to be a limit to it. But the general view I'm coming to is roughly consequentialism for outside shocks and absolutism for things that are under your control here as an industry. So I think in some circumstances, yes, it is wrong to put a price on life. But if there are things you can do. Now, there are all sorts of problems with this. I've talked for much longer than I was intending to. So I think rather than me tell you what the problems are with what I've just said, I'll let you tell me the problems or find new problems. So I'll just stop at that point and see where we go in the discussion.
Thank you, Jonathan.